Good morning, everyone. And good morning, Reverend McCarty. It's good to have you with us. Let me introduce Reverend McCarty. He is a Sanshin board member, and he is the secretary of the board. As it says on our website, a great part of Reverend Dennis McCarty's life has been dedicated to the beauty and subtlety of the English language. He has written well-received novels and nonfiction books, plays, essays, magazines, articles, and is a dedicated lyricist and songwriter. Over the years, he has been a sailor, an electrician doing heavy construction, a teacher, a nationally published novelist, and of course, a minister. He first encountered Zen while teaching English in South Korea in the 1990s, and it has influenced his religious outlook ever since. He studies Sanshin style Zen, he says, not as a Buddhist, but to become a better, more thoughtful Unitarian Universalist and person. So, thank you. I think you need to unmute yourself. We cannot hear you. There we go.
Sound.
You're in and out. You're breaking up. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, in that case, I'll plug in these speakers. Oddly enough, I went with the full SkyPilot mode because I didn't trust my computer's mic or sound system. They've been a bit strange of late, but it shows what I know. As soon as you think you know something, you're already in trouble. Boy, if I lived that reality a bunch in my life. But you can hear me now, okay?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. We'll go with what we got then. Well, I'm honored, delighted, and a little nervous to be here. I'm afraid I'm going to have to keep the dark glasses on because I have very light sensitive eyes. And for the first time, I'm going to try reading my Dharma talk because I work from a script from the laptop. So we'll see how that works. But it is a true honor to be here. I'm not remotely a Dharma teacher. I am ordained as a Unitarian Universalist minister. For the record, that's not the one you buy in the mail. Our tradition does require considerable training, so I do have a religious foundation, even if it's not in Soto Zen. Deep truth is deep truth. Wisdom is not divided. So this morning we'll try to come at the same Dharma, but from a slightly different direction. My tradition, Unitarian Universalism, is a product of Western intellectual and religious thought. And one reason I practice Zen is that Zen corrects what to me are some of the biggest mistakes in Western religious thought, the first of which was to make it about God and the afterlife in the first place, rather than what we do with what we have in this moment, here and now. Now, I'm an atheist, but in Western thought, even atheism is still attached to God talk. The basic argument is still about the God and afterlife atheists don't believe in. For example, so-called new atheist Richard Dawkins totally agrees with evangelical Christians on one point, and that is the nature of the God that he doesn't believe in. And he's written about this and his disdain for any idea that we might conceive of a different sort of God. One beauty of Zen is that it recognizes that God or no God, heaven, hell, or nothing at all, our job does not change. We have to work with what we have in the moment, moment by moment. Whatever my individual belief or non-belief happens to be, my practice in this moment stays the same. Another thing I see as a mistake in Western religion is that it's totally about separation. In Jewish scripture, the Hebrew word for holy comes from the same root as the Hebrew word for separate. Western religion is deep in dualistic thinking, order versus chaos, God versus Satan, heaven versus hell, and it's not lost on me that the United States is the most fundamentalist Christian industrialized nation, and our politics are Republican versus Democrat. I don't think that's a coincidence. Zen, of course, is about interconnectedness and oneness. I'm going to get back to a little more of that in a minute. Something else I appreciate in Zen is the insight into the inadequacy of language. Dharma teachers often say words are only a finger pointing at the moon. And as a writer, I have often struggled with that very challenge, the mismatch between the reality I'm trying to express and the clumsy words I have to express it with. Many years ago, discussing poetry with a friend, I suggested that the only perfect poem would have to be a blank sheet of paper. And she thought I was crazy. And it turns out I was just preconditioned to study Zen. That was before I'd even really heard of Zen other than just as a social term. And finally, 1,000 years before scientists began to unlock the secrets of the human brain, Zen masters already recognized the limitation of thinking, what we in the West call reason. Thinking and reason actually turn out to be scientifically inaccurate terms, at least the way we generally use them, and more on that in a moment as well. Now, I started in Zen with what's called the Kwanum School in South Korea. It's not better or worse than Soto Zen, it's just a bit different. And for several years in the mid-1990s, I taught English in Suwon, South Korea, and that's about 30 miles south of Seoul. And when I decided to study foreign ministry, I returned to Korea to teach and save money for divinity school. And I decided to get some firsthand experience with non-Western religion. One thing led to another, and I wound up taking a train up to Seoul on weekends for beginner classes at the International Zen Center at Hagisa Temple on the north side of the city. Returning to that Zen insight into human thinking and reasoning, Kwanum Dharma teachers would often say, as soon as you start to think, you've already made a mistake. In other words, not unlike the inadequacy of words, these labyrinthine workings of our minds distort any reality as soon as our brains start to process it. One of my favorite religious sources, Scientific American magazine, Yale University cognitive science professor John A. Bark writes, quote, when psychologists try to understand the way our mind works, they frequently come to a conclusion that may seem startling. People often make decisions before they have thought about them consciously. When we decide how to vote, what to buy, where to go on vacation, and myriad other things, unconscious thoughts that we are not even aware of typically play a big role. Research has recently brought to light just how profoundly our unconscious mind shapes our day-to-day interactions. Close quote. In other words, our actions are most directed by thoughts we don't even know we have. And by the time we realize we're thinking about something, the mistake, to use the Kwanum term, has already been made. From there, conscious reason is all too likely to be used only to justify the decision our unconscious mind has already made. Ancient Zen masters recognized how our minds can be such clever, not to mention deceptive, monkeys. 95%, this is according to Professor Bark, 95% of our mental processing and decision making take place below conscious level. Now, that does not make us irrational, but it does make it very hard to rationally evaluate the decisions we're making. Don't believe everything your mind tells you. John Bark writes about Sigmund Freud, quote, Freud's massive body of work emphasized the conscious as the locus of rational thought and emotion, and the unconscious as the lair of the irrational. Rational versus irrational. And it's still an insult in this culture to say that a person's not using reason, particularly if you're a guy. But I mention this because it goes right back to that ancient Western religious dualism. Freud's distinction between the rational conscious and the irrational unconscious was just him unconsciously buying into Western dualism. Freud's theories were greatly shaped by his own prejudices and cultural assumptions about reason, about emotion, and while we're at it, not least, about women. Bark writes, quote, contemporary cognitive psychologists have recast the Freudian worldview. Both types of thought processes, it turns out, help us get through the world safely and productively. But, and this is what makes Zen study useful, of course, those processes are not without error and distortion. So, Freud made a big contribution by naming the unconscious mind as a powerful but little understood force in human behavior. And where he went wrong was in describing the brain's working as basically this dualistic competition between the irrational id and the reasoning ego and superego. And of course, for the sake of time, I'm oversimplifying somewhat. But again, pitting those dualistic perceived opposites against one another, Freud was just regurgitating Western religious and philosophical stereotypes that were thousands of years old, even in his day. The dualism between order and chaos, between good and evil, and of course, the biggest of them all, between heaven and hell. Atheist and scientist, though he thought he was, Freud's scientific assumptions were shaped by religious ideas so deeply ingrained in Western culture, they were not even visible to him. In his book, Religion Explained, The Evolutionary Origins of Religious Thought, anthropologist Pascal Boyer writes about how ideas evolve, same as species. Western religious dualism has been evolving for at least 4,000 years since the ancient Mesopotamians and what is now Iraq, the old ancient Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, tells us how their ruling god, Marduk, defeated Tiamat, the sea dragon of chaos. We don't even have time to go into that, how sexually loaded that imagery is. In ancient Judaism, the God of Abraham and Moses, technically spelled out as YHWH in scripture, Yahweh, the tetragrammation it's called, started out as the national warrior god of the Hebrews, their version of Marduk. Yahweh also imposed order over chaos and gave his people victory and a homeland. And I can't resist mentioning, just have to say this, the oldest verses in the Bible do mention other gods besides Yahweh. And in fact, he even had a wife, the goddess Asherah. And that lasted until 624 BC, when Judea's king Josiah had her image taken out of Jerusalem's temple and burned. And that's all right in the Bible, book of 2 Kings to be exact. But bachelor or single, Yahweh, the warrior God, was believed to give us, good people, victory over them, that is, ungood, unrighteous people in other nations. It's all about dualism. God is separate from us, holy is separate from unholy, us is separate from and better than them. And you can see the sociology there too. Greeks and Romans didn't look at righteousness the same way the Hebrews did, but they did share the dualism. Reason and civilization meant that their order against the chaos of uncivilized, unreasoning barbarians who happened to populate the lands they were conquering. And while they were at it, they also associated reason and order with men and emotion and disorder with women. And that also descended through the evolution of Western thought. Despite the advances of the Enlightenment and scientific revolution, Freud's research is full of those prejudices, and a lot of our cultural thinking still is. But reason and that thing we call a mind doesn't even exist, at least not the way we traditionally think of them. One of my favorite scientists, the anthropologist Ian Tattersall, writes, quote, "The mind is a complex thing, not in the sense that an engineered machine is, with many separate parts working smoothly together in pursuit of a single goal, but in the sense that it is a product of ancient reflective emotional components overlain by a veneer of reason." A veneer of reason only. We have not evolved past the brain structures that govern the behavior of some very remote ancestors indeed. And it is precisely the interaction, he writes, between the ancient and the more recently evolved structures in our brain that makes us not only unique in many very admirable ways, but also uniquely dangerous, as much to ourselves as to the rest of the living world. Close quote. We are wonderful, terrible, lovable, dangerous creatures. Thinking is just a figure of speech for complex chemical reactions and electrical processes taking place in widely separated areas throughout the brain. We're just as capable of poisoned thinking as we are of skillful action. University of Southern California neuroscientist Alberto Damasio, there we go, studies patients' behavior when their brains have been damaged in various ways. For example, he writes about a man he calls Elliot. Elliot was a successful professional, and when he began to act strangely, doctors discovered a small tumor on the frontal lobe of his brain. They removed the tumor, but when Elliot returned to work, he was unable to make important decisions. He couldn't do his job. He threw money away on ridiculous financial schemes and lost his life savings. It's really quite a sad story. And yet, and this is the important part, Elliot aced every test they gave him on personality and intelligence. Quote, his memory, intellect, and speech were normal to excellent. His powers of conscious reason were far above average. But further examination showed that the tumor had damaged regions of Elliot's brain responsible for emotional processing, basically between risk and reward. He could still reason better than most people, but because he no longer could sense his own feelings, he was no longer wise enough to even hold down his job. Another of Damasio's subjects was an elite competitive bridge player who suffered a stroke in that same region of his brain. And again, he did perfectly well on all tests of reasoning power, but he too became helpless at getting through life. And he also became terrible at bridge. He would take the most outlandish chances. Again, he had become deaf to his subconscious emotional processing and unable to make wise decisions. Both men could reason perfectly well to the extent reason can be tested, but they had lost contact with the subconscious emotional portion of their brain that provided wisdom. Our mind, if you want to use that term, is not separate from our physical body. If we let our body or our brain's emotional systems get hurt or overloaded, that can produce extreme behavior. But here's the important part. Bark writes, our unconscious works, quote, less like Freud's zone of impulses and fantasies, and more like a fast, efficient way to process large volumes of data. In other words, what we call emotion is not an either or opposite to what we call reason. Emotion is a crucial component of reason, much of which takes place below the level of consciousness. What's more, we operate on very limited information. In their book, Philosophy in the Flesh, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson show that our nervous system is only capable of processing about 10% of the sensory information that's actually around us. So our brain has to use kind of subconscious shorthand to work with the limited data that it's able to collect and process. And Bark writes, the conscious reason deals with only about 5% of that. So our conscious awareness, our reason, to use the traditional word, a little bit obsolete word, is working with only 5% of that 10% that our nervous system can process. The rest of reality goes by unnoticed, but our brain creates the illusion that we're seeing, hearing, and feeling a unified whole. Doing the math then, the world we consciously know about is really only half of 1% of what's actually going on. Now, to me, that is just fascinating. And it's also really, really humbling. And it also helps me appreciate the sublimely perceptive beauty of the Heart Sutra. All 5 skandhas are empty. No form, no feeling, perception, impulses, consciousness, not because they don't exist, but because our brain physically cannot process enough information to fully understand form or emptiness. Scientifically, we're moving through the illusion that our mind is creating moment by moment. Now, obviously, early Zen masters could not have told you about interactions between our forebrain and cerebral cortex and limbic system, but they sure perceived that something was going on. They understood that the more thinking we apply to it, the farther we are likely to stray from reality, what we might call the Buddha nature, or whatever it is we're thinking about. So the best practice is just practice. Let the mind become still, bow, chant, sit, zazen. Of course, we don't do Zen practice to achieve a particular result. The practice is the result. If we let the brain's different structures cease whirling and move into a space where all those false opposites, mind, body, cultural heritage, begin to fall away, we can create space to better understand the lessons from life's experiences and create the more skillful action that Zen practice calls us toward. Just one illustration, one personal life lesson for me. One day in Korea, I was going to work on a crowded bus when an elderly man got on. And I had studied up on Korean culture. I had read that it's polite to offer your seat to an older person. So using my very limited Korean, I stood up and invited him to sit down. Now, he was visibly suspicious and he said no. And it's important to note, and the joke is on me here, that I didn't understand Korean well enough to get much of what he was telling me. I gestured and invited again, and he finally started to sit. And as he was sitting down, without thinking, I put a hand on his shoulder, which you may know, in some cultures, Korea and Japan among them, is very disrespectful. He shot out of that seat and gave me a dressing down I will never forget. I don't know much Korean. I didn't know much Korean then, but he definitely got his point across that we Americans needed to mind our own business and quit thinking we're better than other people, or words to that effect. Now, my Dharma teachers would sometimes tell us that because life is full of suffering, being born is the worst mistake you can possibly make. After that, further mistakes are minor by comparison, so don't worry too much about them. At times like my bus riding gaffe with the elderly Korean gentleman, I appreciate that piece of wisdom. I was very embarrassed, but no one died. We got to my bus stop and I got off. But minor mistake or not, it was definitely a teachable moment. And I've reflected often on it since then. For one thing, I knew better than to put my hand on that man's back. I'd read that in the very same book I read where it was polite to offer him my bus seat. My mind knew better, but my body didn't know better. I came out of a culture where a pat on the back made me feel good. In moments of affection or approval, sometimes I give other people a pat on the back. So it was mostly a gesture of friendship, mostly. But even in the West, a pat on the back is kind of a complex gesture. Teammates, equals often pat one another on the back. A superior may pat a subordinate on the back, and that feels really good to me. But even in the West, it rarely goes the other direction. You don't often see a worker patting the boss on the back. So, for starters, the man's expression and tone of voice and my inability to follow his Korean so that I couldn't really even know what he was telling me all really should have been warning signals. But I had this little piece of knowledge and I knew a couple of phrases in Korean. I had a really bad case of full cup mind. My mind was so full of those little pieces of knowledge that I wasn't listening to him. I didn't have the language skills. And what's more, I wasn't really even listening to myself. So, friendly though my gesture seemed, seemed to me anyway, it was not 100% pure. There was ego bubbling around in there as a person and as an American. And then just a few weeks later, karma will provide, just a few weeks later, President Bill Clinton visited South Korea. And I watched the newscast on the English language Armed Forces Korea television network as he made an appearance with South Korea's president at the time, Kim Young-sam. And when the two of them ended, or when the photo op ended, and the two of them turned to go back into the executive mansion, Bill Clinton reached out his hand and put it on Kim Young-sam's back. Well, that made me feel better. Clinton's a smart guy. Surely his advance team had to have briefed him on Korean etiquette, but there it was. Kim Young-sam did not react the same way the man on the bus had. He was a national leader, a politician, and he had probably learned what to expect from those arrogant, dumb Americans. But the moment did hint that our president was looking on South Korea as rather a junior partner in that alliance. And in full honesty, I can't say that I was above that kind of arrogance either. We make mistakes. We misunderstand one another. Desires swim around in our minds, often below our own awareness, and then they surface and we do give offense or we do harm without meaning to, often because we don't know better, all too often because we're just being careless. No one is immune, which is why people need written laws, contracts, and codes of conduct, which is where I'm going with this. Mind you, if I'm not so naive as to say written laws are perfect or just, but at least they're on paper in black and white so that we can look at them and try to parse out and maybe even improve them. For the record, I'm going to just throw this in here. That is something you cannot do with unwritten rules. They're not seen, they're not talked about, and they almost always privilege one set of people over others. And our culture is full of unwritten rules that are way more unfair than the written ones. That's a topic for a different day. But it's also the reason most American Soto Zen centers have codes of ethics. They differ in detail, but they all prescribe how we're to treat one another, that we're to avoid verbal or physical abuse, harassment, discrimination, illegal activity, etc. One exception up until last month was the Sanshin Zen community. We did not have one, but now we do. Our board of directors recently approved it, and I want to introduce it. It'll be posted at the Zen Center when we return to face-to-face practice. It's a bit long, kind of weighty, 12 pages. So for convenience sake, there's this summary on the first page with item by item page numbers. That'll hopefully serve as a shortcut if you do happen to have an ethical concern or conflict or problem. You can find the item you're looking for, hopefully without having to read through the whole thing, although hopefully it's worth reading. You'll also notice that general topics, broad topics, are in boldface type. We human beings are such wonderful creatures and so clever, as in the example I gave where the joke was on me with the elderly gentleman on the bus. Sometimes we're so clever, we get ourselves into trouble. And we do need written guidelines that deal with specific mistakes we can make. And the ethics policy begins with and takes its direction from the 16 precepts that form the ethical framework of the Soto Zen tradition. But to quote from the ethics policy, part that was written by a writer more experienced and profound than myself, I might add, quote, "Previous boards have assumed that the precepts alone were enough to ensure organizational health and have been dismayed to find that this was not the case. Simply taking precepts even when ordaining as clergy does not guarantee wholesome behavior or the understanding of inappropriate conduct, much less does it indemnify anyone from misunderstandings, mistakes, or the need for ongoing learning." As a Unitarian Universalist minister, I can only observe that I wish our churches were more like Soto Zen centers. In that way, life would be a lot easier for a lot of ministers and members. But back to the ethics policy, I don't think there are a lot of surprises in this one. Avoid harming others, maintain appropriate behavior, maintain confidentiality and mindful speech, practice healthy relationships and boundaries, including sexual boundaries, avoid misuse of intoxicants, be mindful of the teacher-student relationship, and also a reminder to be helpful and gentle with newcomers. Of course, the devil, as we say in the West, is in the details, because given the complexity of our minds and cultures and human behavior, it is possible to cross a line without meaning to. So there are a couple of points I want to go into in more detail. The first is sexual boundaries. I don't think there's any aspect of human behavior that can blow up on you faster than sexuality. American society is only in the last few years really starting to deal with how much sexual harassment and sexual abuse takes place, how easy it is to fall into, and how much of it happens at religious institutions. And that's something that can easily sneak up on a person. The policy states that if you meet someone you're attracted to here and the two of you decide to date, that's okay. It's also not the primary reason we're here. This community exists to preserve the teachings and practices of the Buddhas and ancestors, and to provide support and guidance for practitioners. And here's the important part: to persist in romantic advances when those advances are not reciprocated or encouraged is a form of harassment that has no place here. Close quote. In other words, it's not just about yes or no answers or not getting a straight answer. If you're not getting energy back, just stop. Now, I've been a straight male my whole life. Particularly as a younger single man, it didn't take much to encourage me. Sexual energy is strong energy, and this Sangha is a place to be very careful with it. That's particularly the case between teachers and students, and between clergy and lay practitioners. The Sanshin teaching method creates intimate conditions which can provoke or nurture attraction. And when there's attraction across a power differential, sexuality can quickly and easily become abusive. Many religious traditions have had clergy sex abuse scandals, including my own, much more than what gets in the newspapers. I cannot tell you how disappointed I was to learn quite recently that Zen master Sung San Sun Sanim, the supposedly celibate founder of the International Kwanun School of Zen, where I studied, carried on numerous affairs with women in the Zen centers he founded. Revelation of this causes division, people left, and really they're still cleaning up the mess years later. The same thing has happened in Sanghas of other Buddhist traditions as well. My own tradition, the Unitarian Universalist tradition, has also had scandals. Some of our brightest lights, ministers once deeply revered, have committed clergy sexual abuse. And as their colleague, that's a bit heartbreaking for me. But the greater problem is the pain and conflict it causes the congregations and the communities, and of course, not always, but usually the women on the receiving end. It doesn't just harm the abused person. The conflict and divisions go on after that clergy person has left and even after they've died. And it is abuse. Again, across that power differential between clergy and student, there is no such thing as informed consent. As a single man starting divinity school, I was probably lucky. Before I even started, I happened to buy a used book about sexual relationships across professional boundaries, not just clergy, but doctors, lawyers, psychiatric counselors, and their clients. And I found that book downright scary. It is so easy to slip into. But again, there's no such thing as consent across that kind of power differential. I came out of a family that did not have good boundaries. That book made plain how easy it is to fall into an unethical sexual relationship, even when that wasn't the abuser's original intent. And that's why I felt lucky, because forewarned is forearmed, particularly across teacher, student, and clergy practitioner boundaries. The best watchword, again, is just don't. Having said that, and my divinity school, having spent time studying clergy sexual abuse and the deep problems it can cause, it's still a subject of deep denial in religious communities. The Quantum School strikes me as still somewhat in denial about the harm their founder did, and my own Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association did not pass a policy against clergy-congregant sexual relationships until just a couple of years ago, or an ethics policy with real teeth till just last June, and some ministers fought both those policies tooth and nail. As Professor Damasio's research shows, we need our emotions for us to be wise. But when it comes to sexuality, even that's not reliable. Desire clouds thinking. Hormones never sleep. Again, forewarned is hopefully forearmed. Now, for a happier note, the other point I wanted to look at is what's called restorative justice. In the West, ethics and our legal system have centered largely on the idea of retribution. A person did this bad thing, now they have to suffer these consequences. With restorative justice, the focus shifts to what harm took place, to whom, and what needs to be done, working together to mend the harm. It's not about crime and punishment. It's about how things can go wrong between people and how people can work together to regain learning, trust, and awakening. Modern restorative justice goes back a couple of generations and has been quite successful where it's been used. It acknowledges that harm has taken place, how it took place, and the involved parties try to work toward consensus on what needs to happen to mend the harm as much as possible. It's not a legal process, it's relational. For the record, it was the concept behind the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and if it can produce healing for offenses and system-wide oppression that serious, it ought to be adequate to handle good faith conflict or policy violation in our Zen community. But the good faith piece, that's the key. That may not be as easy as it sounds, as in the case of the elderly Korean gentleman. I didn't mean to give offense, consciously at least, but the offense definitely happened. Luckily here, we don't have the language barrier to overcome, but there still is the possibility, even likelihood, of anger, shame, and defensiveness when someone is told they did something hurtful to somebody else. But one thing we come here to learn is how to overcome those three poisons: anger, ignorance, and greed. And the point of restorative justice, certainly on the Sangha level, is not to debate the objective reality of the harm or hurt someone feels. The mind is a clever monkey. When a person is called to account and they become defensive, that debate can be endless, and the conflict, greater conflict, is the likely result. So to prevent conflict, we need to cultivate the emotional wisdom to deal with the feelings of harm in another person, to acknowledge them, and to reach agreement on what needs to happen to mend the harm. Sometimes, even when the harm is unintentional, that can require real commitment to best practice in the here and now between two people. I'll give you an example from my own ministry. A couple of members of my congregation were both quite accomplished. They both had projects they wanted me to announce one Sunday. I announced the man's event first, had him raise his hand and said, anyone wanting to take part, just talk to Bob after the service. Then I announced his wife Nancy's event and finished with, talk to Nancy after the service. She's the one sitting next to Bob. And folks chuckled, and I didn't think any more about it until after the service. Nancy came up to me and she was not pleased. She's normally pretty shy, but she said, no uncertain terms. I've been working my whole life to develop my writing career and my work career. I am not just the person sitting next to my husband. I apologized, and that was sincere because I could see where she was coming from, and she was right. Women are too often dismissed in our culture, even now. I made sure to do a better job acknowledging her work, and I did so. But I will say, part of my mind wanted to weasel away from responsibility. It was an accident. I didn't mean anything by it. She was making a big deal out of nothing. I am relieved that I didn't listen to that part of my mind because it just would have made a small conflict possibly into a bigger one. And that was, in fact, one reason I think I had a respectful relationship with that congregation. One example from my ethics policy is if someone eats a cookie or too many cookies from a plate prepared for a gathering, and I can honestly say I have no boundaries at all around food. So that's a transgression I could easily fall into. So how do I make amends? Restorative justice asks that I acknowledge the harm and try to mend it. In this case, that might mean acknowledging the frustration of the person who baked the cookies. It might include apologizing to the group the cookies were baked for. It might include replacing the cookies in some way. But the point is to get away from this adversarial prosecutor versus defense dualism, here we go again, of the Western legal system, and get into a relational process between people, trying to be people of good faith, working toward mutual learning and awakening. Now, I'm not so naive as to believe every ethics violation or conflict can be easily resolved just between the people directly involved. So there is a sequence of further steps. And the whole policy, of course, is written under the umbrella of federal, state, and local laws, which we're required to follow. But the point is, we are all just complex beings trying to get through a challenging world as skillfully as possible. Now, that does not prevent us from making mistakes. As far as that's concerned, that doesn't keep people from being downright dysfunctional at times. All we can do is practice together to be in the moment together and to put down our ego enough to accept that half of 1% of information we have about the world is not likely to perfectly match that half of 1% somebody else has. So there will be disagreements. That's just another thing the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are trying to teach us. All 108 Dharma gates are open to us, but we need to open our hands and hearts to enter. Thank you. And I'll gladly entertain questions or comments.
Reverend McCarty.
Yes.
Yes.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Hoko, please.
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you for a very good talk. I just want to mention to folks that the ethics policy to which Dennis referred will go up on the website in the next few days. So it will, it's just been approved. So it'll go up there so everybody can see it, read it, be familiar with it. You haven't seen it yet, but coming soon. Hoshin, over to you.
Yes, I'll try to frame this best I can. I really like your philosophy. It seems to be massaged pretty well from a science point of view. And personally, I read science all the time. So it's what I read when I go to bed at night. You know, it's one of those things that I really enjoy. Yeah. So, and this sounds like kind of a simple question, but I think I want to somehow get it back to the scientific basis of it. But in your mind, in your own wisdom, do you believe that dualism is a default position?
I believe it's an unexamined position. I think we can get there, certainly in this culture, we can get there very easily. And I think we always need to take a good, again, don't believe everything your mind is telling you. And certainly I'm probably my own worst offender on that, or close to it. It's very easy to go there. And not to let it be an unexamined position.
Right.
That's the best I got on short notice.
Oh, I know. And I guess something I think about a lot is where it comes from. So for me, it's an idea of kind of deconstructing the idea of dualism. And that's, I think, something that we do as practitioners, to sit and watch our minds. And then there's that point where there's no distance between the watcher and what you're watching. Yes. And you must know sign language too. So, so what I'm coming down to is this idea that on even a quantum level, the idea that, the smallest particles require this constant tension and balance in order to create mass, to create matter. And so not actually knowing what I'm saying around this, I'm wondering if it can be considered that without that, with that knowledge, that there is that kind of tension and balance that happens, it can be the same. Once we get rid of the emotion of that dualism, it comes down to a really basic way of being in balance, I guess. That's not very clear, but I'm trying to get there with it.
Yeah. Well, I know, certainly reading sociologists, when they form people into groups and do experiments on groups of people, that we very automatically form into an in-group, an us and a them. And again, it may be, I think you're suggesting, scientifically inevitable and somewhat usable. And I don't argue that. I mean, I'm here, my books are here. Okay. I don't argue that. I also, but I do say it should not be unexamined. And I'm trying to remain aware of the fact that I often do not have, you have to act in the world whether you've got all the information you should have or not, and often you don't, and then mistakes happen. That I'm very humbled by the very fact that the equipment I'm working with is not well organized. It works fine, sort of. Of course, it causes wars too. But how is it Ian Tattersall puts it, that our very mind is made up of elements that evolved at different rates from different times and perform different functions. Well, for instance, and I felt this in myself because I have PTSD, that your mind can input the exact same piece of information, and two different parts of your brain can interpret it completely different ways. And I think awareness of our own lack of information and our own fallibility. Boy, as soon as I think I know something, I know I've learned I'm headed in a direction that can be risky.
Right, right.
So get on the pillow, let all of that center, let it all fall away, and that certainly helps me.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you.
I've got kind of a question. So there's a book that I end up sort of mentioning a lot called The Making of Buddhist Modernism, which I think you might be interested in, actually, which sort of the sort of main idea is that a lot of Western assumptions, so you were talking about how Western assumptions inform, a lot of, sort of every aspect of decisions that we make, even if we think that we're somehow stepping outside of, tradition, we're still sort of bound by that tradition. And the main sort of thesis of this book is, when Buddhism was imported to Western countries, a lot of those assumptions made it into sort of the foundational way that we think about Buddhism. And not only that, but also because of the colonial encounter and the sort of pushing of Protestant Christianity on colonized people, that they packaged Buddhism in such a way that it reflected those assumptions. So I'm sort of, I guess my question is, as a Protestant minister, do you feel like in your exploration of Buddhism, you've noticed any of those things? Yeah, Hoko's holding up the book there. If you've, for instance, your practice experience in Korea versus the United States, I wonder if you have anything that you've noticed in that regard.
Well, Buddhism, the way Americans see Buddhism, I'd be a little suspicious that, especially Americans in America. And of course, there's all kinds of like this New Age Buddhism out there. The you're good enough kind of flavor of Buddhism. I've seen that preached. So I think we've done all sorts of things with that message. I think, and I'm having trouble getting a grip on my train of thought here. Again, compassion is compassion. Humility is humility. Silence is silence. And I think as soon as we start putting names on things, and also programming is programming, and we're all programmed. I've spent certainly from about age, maybe 40 on, maybe before that, reviewing my own programming culturally and how it's influenced me in ways I still take part in it or still follow it without thinking about it. So I think, again, I'll tell you a story. And I'm right now, I'm in two different places. Again, my first few years in Buddhism were in the Quantum School, which is considerably different, not better, just different. And I'm realizing that I need to leave that behind. If I'm going to study Soto Zen, I need to be with Soto Zen. Okay. At the same time, there are some terminologies and attitudes, and not to mention the shock of finding out that our founding teacher committed sexual misconduct, and this is a rough one for me, that the teachers I was studying under knew it. And so this thing goes through your mind frankly, can I believe any of the shit these people are telling me? But there are pieces of truth that are worth keeping. And I think I'll just say this, I think we get in a little trouble when we start creating categories. You know, again, truth is truth as best we can perceive it. I mean, that's why we have science, so we have some replicability so that we can at least have predictability. Compassion is compassion. Sitting is just sitting. Emptiness is just emptiness. And one thing they would tell us, that when we start to create stuff in our minds, we begin to lose stuff. And I think there's probably some truth to that. So I'm always a little suspicious of categories, as I know Hoko was too. She called me on one the other night. So I'm also both an observer and offender on that.
Thank you.
Well, that's the best you're gonna get. I don't know if that was an adequate answer.
No, I think that's a great answer. You know, I'm in a religious studies department at IU, so you know, I'm deeply embedded in categories all the time. So
let me
but not
tell
when
you
I sit.
and this is, I'm going to go against my own advice here. This was a Dharma lesson we were at with a teacher who's still around, and I won't go into details. Very good teacher though. And they had a question and answer session like this one. And somebody, and of course, sometimes people ask questions not to get an answer, but to show how smart they are. I won't say that I've never been part of that. And so this fellow starts asking about similarities between Buddhism and Stoicism. And I won't say there aren't some, you know, maybe there are some. And then the teacher says, don't create things in your own mind. When you create things in your mind, you lose everything. That was one of their standard things. And the guy answers, well, you're a Buddhist monk though. Surely, you know, you have some insight on this. And the guy says, oh, I'm not Buddhist and I'm not a monk. I only wear these robes so that if someone has a problem, they know they can come to me. And I found that an immensely moving answer. I don't even wear those robes, but I do wear that collar sometimes, so that if somebody has a problem, they know I'm there to help them.
Thank you again. It's a good story. I sort of it's something that I've thought about too in terms of Buddhist clothes. You know, I wish you know, Americans knew what it meant when we wear our clothes. Like in Japan they do, but here sometimes they think it's like a karate outfit if we're wearing samurai.
Let me tell you the Unitarian Universalist version of this story, which I heard from the minister of my sponsoring congregation. One of his members had a very severe heart attack and probably was not going to make it. And Tom the minister was visiting him, and Unitarian Universalist, right? We're those secular humanists that everybody complains about. And the member asks, Tom, will you pray for me? And Tom kind of swallows his gum and tries to begin as best a prayer as he can come up with, because we're not very good at that. And the fella sees a Catholic priest walk by. I don't know if it was in the emergency room, probably was, you know, where you're waiting, you see people coming and going. Sees a Catholic priest, and he interrupts Tom and he says, Father, will you pray for me?
I have to say it's kind of interesting, you know, when I travel for Buddhism, travel for Zen, I typically wear Nagasamue, something that looks a little longer, and a raksu. You know, so here I am, American woman, shaved head, something that looks a little unusual. In this country, as Doju says, nobody has a clue what that's about. And yet, I think somehow people look at that and say, well, I don't know what that is, but it's vowed religious. It's like, I don't know what tradition that is, but that's somebody who's made a commitment to some kind of lifestyle or some kind of, not lifestyle, some kind of tradition, right? So I get people, next to me on the plane telling me about their relationships and all kinds of things. So I think there is something about, I don't know, people can recognize something going on. Maybe it's the clothes and maybe it's something else. But I've always thought, sometimes I say to people who are sewing robes and headed for ordination, to me, one of the things the robe is about is it means open for business. As soon as we put these things on, it's like open for business. My life is now about, the practice and it's like, here's Buddha's life, which I'm carrying in the world. Lately, some of you have heard me talk about the Red Cross vest. When I travel for Red Cross, I wear the vest and the same kind of thing happens. It's like, well, I don't know what you do for the Red Cross, but but there's something happening there. So it's interesting what we carry into the world, right? I frequently, if I stop at the gas station and I happen to have some way, somebody wants to know if I'm a karate person, So, Doju's absolutely right. We get all kinds of crazy things. But underlying it, there's sometimes some recognition. I know, when I talk to, I have a friend who for a while was in the convent back in the day when they actually wore some habits and stuff. And it was kind of the same thing with them. It was like they wore that in the community and people knew that was somebody that could help. In Japan, when I was training, our abbot always made sure if we were headed out to another temple or we were leaving the temple frequently, we had to be in Kuromoraku at least. He said, we have to look like monks because when people see monks, they can't do something bad.
I don't know. It's Mark. I don't know if I have a question or more or less an observation. But one of the things I noticed is through the exposition of dichotomy, there was an underlying aspect, or there was an underlying dichotomy that's actually not often realized or expressed, and but it's often used, and we use it all the time in Buddhism, and that's the division between reality and unreality. And I don't know. I'm kind of curious to your thoughts, or yeah, I'm kind of curious to know on your thoughts on and just in a religious concept, and just in a religious practice, regardless of type or creed, how to overcome that division, how to overcome that dichotomy between the real and the unreal. And the other, and then you've got that, you got a quantifying follow up to that as of what are the markers of that? How would you know the division between the real and the unreal?
I'm not sure that's the problem as much as attachment is the problem to either what we think is reality or unreality. Has everybody seen the movie Rosemary's Baby? And right at the end of it, and they got the the baby carries the perambulator there, and there's this upside down cross hanging from it. And the satanic temple would not exist if it were not for Christianity. And atheists like myself, and I'm trying to get away from this, and I've done a lot of work on it and made progress. But atheism, again, in this culture, is still all about Christianity. I mean, I know what God I don't believe in, and that's the one. And don't you tell me that God or karma or Buddha could be anything different than that. So reality, unreality, I think we need to be very careful on what we're saying is real and what's unreal. Again, because our mind produces all kinds of stuff that we may think is real, But again, I've got PTSD. I know my mind does all kinds of stuff that it thinks is real, and it's not. But if you've got if I can hit this board and it makes a noise, it's probably real. You do have predictability and unpredictability, and they're both useful in different ways. So reality, unreality. I think awareness and not thinking, not being too sure which is real and which is unreal. Is that helpful? I mean, hell, you know 10 times more philosophy than I do, Mark. So I don't know if I'm going to give you anything you haven't already thought of.
Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing about that question, of course, is in the largest possible perspective, there's no difference. This one unified reality includes our delusions, our mistakes, our hallucinations. So in the largest possible sense, there's no real difference. There's no separation between what's real and unreal. If we can conceive it, it's real because it's real as an idea, or it's certainly part of this one unified reality. We can't say there's this reality and then there's something outside of it. It doesn't work, right? Everything is within Buddha's way. Everything is within this one unified reality. But I think Mark raises an interesting question. How do we know, if we're going to make a distinction, like how do we know which things are real and which are things that we've created, which doesn't make them unreal, but puts them in another category if we want to sort of categorize it. So we can really go down the rabbit hole with that question. It's a really interesting question. There's a lot there to chew on. So Dennis, your initial response about maybe what's more important is, are we attached to one side or another? Are we attached to the idea that the rational is real and that anything else is not real because it's not tangible, or it's, something from which we want to be separate? There's a lot of stuff there to practice with, I think. There's no easy answer, and there's a lot to chew on.
If I can go back to the teaching moment I had, or the learning moment I had with the angry bodhisattva gentleman I met on the bus, my desire to be polite and generous was real. At the same time, I was ignoring for information that would have helped me. I was treating it as though it was not real. I was ignoring it. And so therefore his anger was real. And on the one hand, I was deeply embarrassed in the moment. On the other hand, he gave me a lesson that's lasted me for, oh my God, 25 years now. How not cool, or how cool is that? The strife came when I was attached to that one little piece of reality that I had in my head, and not paying attention to other realities. What reality he was coming from, I can't tell you in detail, but I would guess he had some bad experiences with Americans. So yeah, I think it's what we're attached to that where we can, and then boy, is that easy. I do that easily.
Well, and so there you raise another interesting point, which is there's a lot of reality that we don't see. There's a lot of reality of which we are not aware.
Like 90% of it.
Yeah. So the unreality is actually our idea that there are some things which are separate from this one unified reality. I mean, we can say in a big way, that's unreality, right? So I mean, you can really kind of get caught up with it. So yeah, I mean, I think if we say, well, this or that doesn't exist because I don't perceive it, that's not how reality works. I think one of the central teachings of our practice is we can't see everything in this limited human form. Our causes and conditions mean that there are things we're going to miss, or we are going to want to separate from, and we're going to want to pretend those things, aren't real, don't exist. And yet, the reality is we're not separate from anything, right? If I'm suffering, the world is suffering, vice versa, right? There's no, we can't deny interconnection. So when we talk about greed, anger, and ignorance, ignorance is about, we don't understand how the world works because we can't take it all in. We can't perceive it. As you say, we can't process it all, so that's one of the big reasons why our practice is always incomplete and why vow and repentance are always together, right? I mean, we vow to save all beings. We know that's not possible. Our repentance is not about saying I'm a terrible person because I can't save all beings and because I can't see 100% of reality. Repentance simply means I accept that I'm limited, and that my practice will never be done. There will never be an end point where I cross the finish line and say, now I've carried out all of my bodhisattva vows. So I think acknowledging our limitations, our inability to see 100% of reality, that is the whole vow and repentance dynamic which drives our practice, right? So again, this is why, Mark raises this question, and it's like there's just so many places to go with that. It's a really good question.
Well, it's worth mentioning that our country is in the mess it's in because we have such vast differences between different groups of people on what's real and what's not.
True. There's one big wrench, I think, that we're thrown into this conversation that we're somehow ignoring, or it's just not come up yet, but any reality is mutable, perpetually mutable. And no reality is graspable, totally graspable.
Can I ask, what do you mean by mutable?
Yes.
Ocean.
Yes.
Can I ask, what do you mean by mutable?
It's ungraspable, constantly ungraspable.
And
We
changing
think
all
we
the
know
time.
it, we think we have the answer, we think we see the boundaries, but it's constantly shifting, and it's, also too big for us to grasp. We have pretty narrow vision, I think, as it is. That's the problem with words too. As soon as you say a word, it creates a boundary in our mind.
Here, here.
And
Here, it distorts.
how do you dismantle that? How do you get away from that? I mean, we sit and, have these moments where all of a sudden everything kind of shifts and blends, but you try and hold on to that, you're just doing the same thing. So.
And I think that this is why, Yogacara teaches essentially that consciousness itself is reality. There is nothing outside of that. There's no dualism there. Anything that's appearing in our consciousness is by definition reality. And if we posit anything outside of that, it's just a thought in our consciousness, which is also real. And in that view, there can be no dualism once you kind of accept that view.
True.
Yes.
I have something different. I wanted to say, thanks very much for this talk you gave. What you were talking about in the beginning was really helpful for me. I did not grow up in a Christian upbringing. I mean, and it's only like most recently, I live somewhere very Christian. And I asked my husband to explain something to me that was like a Christian thing. And I said, I don't understand. And he's like, of course you understand, And I said, it's a language that I'm not familiar with. I really didn't grow up this way. And it was really interesting for both of us to understand that. But I've grown up with, what I have grown up with is the idea, it always feels like there's an unspoken thing that Christianity is better, is better. And so I can be in the position I'm in, but we're a Christian nation and I am less than. that's, and, you know, sometimes there are people who I talk to and I have friends and who don't have that opinion. That's not, across the board, but, it's a strange place to be in, to, I don't know, to feel that way. And I feel like I've always tried to work my own way through it. I remember for a long time, people would say, do you believe in God? And I would say, I think you're asking if, you know, if I drink Coke or Pepsi, but I drink water, you know, and try to do that. I tried to go the like non-theistic route, but then I realized, well, you know, somebody said, you know, well, by, you know, literally you're an atheist. And I was like, but I don't want to be against, like, for or against God. Like, that's not my conversation. And it's always been a little bit challenging, but what I'm understanding from what you said, I forget who, but you said that there's this atheist who, you know, he's very close to, you know, and I forget what kind of Christians you said, because they're talking about the same God. I think in a similar sense, what I'm having a hard time letting go of is buying into the duality of, you know, am I in a space where there is Christianity around me that are I feel an energy of actively being pushed down, or do we swap the tables, and so we can say things, you know, that are like, hey, Christianity isn't above anything. You know, I feel like there's this dualistic thing that I don't want to be a part of that either, because it takes so much effort and energy to try to navigate that.
Yeah, one thing I've told my congregations is don't paint all Christians with the same brush. Christianity, like Buddhism, is a very broad, very diverse religion. Yeah, the person I mentioned is Richard Dawkins, who's a famous one of the so-called new atheists. And yet it's striking that his God concept that he doesn't believe in is exactly the same as Jerry Falwell's God concept. And he gets a little irate when told that, well, maybe there are other possibilities. Like what? And the point is, and Carl Sagan wrote this, and I love Carl Sagan. He's an atheist that I find deeply spiritual. The astronomer, he's been dead for several years now. That one problem with God concepts is that as soon as you use that word, you really need to start defining terms, because not everybody's concept of God isn't the same. As far as that's concerned, every Christian's concept of God isn't the same. And that can get pretty diverse as well. But my point is, and actually Zen helped me with this, that God concept, you know, God, no God, heaven, no heaven, hell, no hell, none of that matters. Okay, that is irrelevant. My job stays the same under any of those, unless my job is to believe in that particular God. And then you're dealing with a particular flavor of Christian that's going to have nothing good to say about me and nothing good to say about us. But, you know, that's the way life is.
Yeah, I have some very dear people in my life who are very Christian. I'm not sure what that means, like, but very Christian. And we get along so well because where their Christianity takes them is I feel like gives them freedom. I don't know how it works because, you know, it's, you know, I feel like my religion gives me some freedom, and that's where we interact, and we love it. And, you know, I love when they say, well, you know, blah, 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 this stuff about Jesus makes me happy, because I understand what they're saying, even though I don't understand. And same, and they say, oh, well, in yours, you know, tell me about that. And I love that. So it's, to me, it's not, is there, you know, oh, they believe in God, therefore I don't like them. To me, there's this, and like, like my dad. I don't know if he believes in God. He's a mathematician. But I remember saying something, you know, like dismissive about something Christian. And his response was even, and this is once, this is not where all the problems come from, but he said, he was like, oh, I think we need to respect the Bible. I think we need to respect the, you know, this, that, and the other. And I was kind of did a double take, and I was kind of like, I don't want to have this conversation. And I don't know where you're coming from. So like, no thanks, Dad, period. Which is, I mean, gaslighting, like that. I think that that's the whole, that's what I'm talking about. I feel like even people who don't believe in God, but maybe, I guess, grew up in Christian context, they're often the people who are like, there is an unsaid that Christian is better. You do realize that, even though they have no clue that that's what they're saying. That's what I struggle with. And I don't want to struggle with it. I want to give up this, but I feel like it's, it feels, you were talking about energy in abusive sexual, you know, dynamics, like as that's not the energy it is, but there's a very strong energy there. And I don't know how to, you know, I don't know how to do that.
Well, I think one thing we need to keep our eye out for is what we believe without realizing we believe it. For example, I grew up in mostly Western Colorado and Utah. It doesn't matter. I grew up in the United States to a blue collar class family. My first extended trip outside, and I was in the military, not because I wanted to be, but because it was 1972 and I didn't have a draft deferment. But my first extended experience outside the country was in Korea. And so I grew up believing that America was better, but I didn't know it. And I didn't realize it until I got to Korea. And then I would have these thoughts coming up, and I go, "Holy mackerel! Where did that come from?" I mean, some of them that I believed America was better, and I believed white was better. And I had thoughts, you know, come percolating up in my mind that I would be ashamed to share with this group. So, and again, in that way, it was a beneficial experience because it got some of this stuff out where I could get a handle on it. On Christianity, on the Bible, I got to say the Bible is one of my very favorite. I love the Bible. Actually, I love reading about it more than I love reading it. But there are passages that are just like the Heart Sutra, just. And I really wish more fundamentalist Christians would actually read it. On the other hand, Martin Luther King and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German Lutheran minister who died opposing Hitler. And of course, we know about Martin Luther King. Had they not been theistic, okay, believed in God, believed in heaven and the resurrection, would they have had the courage to do what they did? And I don't have an answer to that question. But you can't fault the kind of strength that their Christianity gave them. So there it is. You know, we choose our way. We hope it strengthens us and helps us do the things we need to do in the world. Sort of like powder milk biscuits back in the old Prairie Home Companion. Then we find out, you know, Garrison Keillor lost his job because he was harassing. What the hell? You know, life is just, yeah.
Iris, I think you raised some really interesting things because it made me step back and think about, for instance, I frequently tell at least my novices, you know, because we're not a mainstream tradition in the West, we are all, as practitioners, we're kind of all doing interfaith work by default because people don't know what our tradition is about. You know, they just know, they might know it's Buddhist, they don't know what it's about. So it's like we're constantly need to be ready to explain our practice. because, maybe people have questions, or at least they don't understand. You made me stop and take a step back and say, that's an interesting assumption on my part, right? I'm already labeling myself as I'm outside. I'm already other because I've decided I'm other. Well, maybe I don't need to do that, right? So I thank you for your question, because now I have some stuff to think about, right? It's kind of interesting how we view ourselves as practitioners in a largely Christian culture. And I'm guessing we've all got a picture. We've all got some assumptions, right? That now we get to step back and go, is that actually true? Or at least, is it helpful? So thank you for that question.
Yes, Carla. Oh, you need to unmute.
Yep. Can you hear me now? Can you? Okay. So again, thank you for such a lovely talk, and thank you, board, for the ethics policy. That's really good news. I really appreciate that. I'm really grateful for that. So to that, and really this relates to everything, and you had just mentioned the word courage, and you told some really lovely stories of vulnerability on your part. That ability, when we engage in a restorative way instead of a retribution kind of way, takes, I think, courage and imagination and humility, and I think all of those go really together. And so to me, it seems like then the next step, it's nice to have, like you said, we have to have it written down first. We have to have something kind of agreed upon. So then how do we, and whether it's as a Sangha or a state or a country, encourage or support people in being courageous and not being afraid of their imagination, and yet being humble at the same time? That is like that, like, how do you do it? Is it possible even? How do we help each other do that? How do we train in that, I guess? Because, with training, we are our training. So how do we help each other train in that? I just like to hear you comment on that.
Are you talking about in the Sangha or in the nation?
Either, both. Yeah, both.
Well, in the Sangha, and I didn't go into great detail in the varying steps. That if you feel confident approaching the person, or they feel confident approaching, and it might be something very slight. And that's the reason I keep harping on putting my hand on the other man's shoulder. You can make a mistake without knowing it. And certainly you can make a mistake unintentionally. And we should be able to talk about that. On the other hand, some folks will tell you what's bugging them, no problem. I'm not one of them. So I would have to suck it up a bit, frankly. If something was bugging me, and I am learning to do that in my own tradition, associating with other men. One thing I'm getting more now is I will turn 70 again this coming summer. I turned 70 this last summer, but COVID was going on, so I decided I'd turn 70 next year instead. Okay.
You're deferring.
I'm getting subjected to more ageism. And I come out of about as privileged a place as a person can come out of. I mean, professional, college educated, white, male, it don't get no better. But now I'm getting old. And so I'm learning to say something about that when assumptions are made. And that's not easy. And now in the ethics policy, if it's hard to do one-on-one, that's preferable. Well, that's the first step. If it's hard to do or can't be done one-on-one, it's okay to find a support person. Possibly even a member of the clergy. If that doesn't work, the idea is to reach a mutual understanding. But of course, there are people in the world, and we have them in my tradition, and it's causing big problems, who refuse to reach a mutual understanding. Okay, and at that point, you have to go to more formal steps.
That's what I was kind of getting at is, yeah.
Well, we had a minister, the first thing he did was lobbied heavily to get our annual convention in his hometown so that his church could be the host church. And then he wrote this obviously very quickly written, not very well written, not very honest book, very much belittling efforts to be supportive of folks that have what we would call disabilities and ethnicities and such. And a lot of folks were really hurt and offended by it. And he has totally refused to talk about it. He says, if you don't like it, that's your problem. Well, some people are like that. At that point, then it has to become a more formal process. And those steps are in there as well. But I didn't go in, hey, we'd have been here a lot more than an hour if I'd got into great detail. So there are further steps that can be taken.
I think it's important too that, ethics policy is one component of what I hope is an overall ongoing effort on everybody's part to create some atmosphere of trust. Where are you more vulnerable in your life than in your spiritual community? People have got to feel safe.
Yeah.
In our Sangha, whether that's in the building or virtually or whatever, people have got to feel safe because, the whole process is about dropping barriers, dropping letting stuff go, which means we're putting ourselves in a vulnerable position. So if we can't have an atmosphere of trust in the Sangha, we've got a problem. We can't really do our practice. So the ethics policy is an important component in a very structured way, in a very written down, pre-thought kind of way to help build the trust. But I think if we ever are experiencing somewhere in the Sangha some disruption of trust, somebody is acting in a way which makes people uncomfortable, makes people feel not safe, is a barrier to practice. And it could be something which on the surface looks pretty innocent. Like if you've ever been in a Sangha where cliques start to form and there's an in-group and an out-group, man, you don't want to go there. Nobody means to create harm, but if you don't get on top of that right away, people stop showing up because they just don't feel welcome and they just don't feel safe, right? So, there's, the big stuff, and then there's just the day-to-day stuff, which is the responsibility of everybody. Yes, it falls on practice leadership, anybody in a robe and anybody leading practice. But I think also, just as a larger Sangha, we need to feel like it's okay to say, this person is doing something that I'm uncomfortable with it. We don't have to do that in a way that's judging. He's right, he's wrong, but just there's something happening there that it doesn't feel good to me. Can we investigate that? Can we talk about it? So, again, if we're comfortable going to that person individually and saying, we really need to talk about this thing, cool. And if not, please find somebody else. Please find Hoshin, Doju, me, Sagan, a board member, somebody, and say, I'm not comfortable with the way this is going. There may be information you don't have. At one time we had somebody in the Sangha who was like fidgeting a lot during Zazen, and someone came to me and said, golly, this person, really needs some training or needs some discipline or something. I said, actually, this person has some health issues. I'm happy he's able to sit 10 minutes, let alone 50. It's like, oh, now we get it, right? But it was something as simple as that. So, I'm calling on everybody here now in our virtual space to continue to create that level of trust where we can practice together. And if something starts to go off the rails, please send the flare.
Shall we close?